That speech turned around the American people, and they ended up supporting that. It was one of the fastest ratified treaties in American history. I'm speaking to you today because the world is once again at a very similar crossroads. As in my uncle's time, nuclear tensions are at an extreme and dangerous level. As in his time, we have a unique opportunity not only to diffuse those tensions, but to take a radically different path, a path towards peace. My uncle's commitment to peace bore fruit in the Limited Test Ban Treaty of August 1963. But his assassination that November turned the nation down another path. His successors have launched one war after another, along with the ceaseless expansion of our military. Some call it the forever war. Every empire ends itself through the expansion of the military, overexpansion of its military abroad. And the founders knew that. John Quincy Adams spoke for all of them when he said, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." Today, I want to recall that memory because this forever war, which has so drained our nation's vitality, now threatens to plunge the world into the unspeakable horror of nuclear Armageddon. And I speak, of course, of the situation in Ukraine. I abhor Russia's brutal and bloody invasion of that nation. But we must understand that our government has also contributed to its circumstances through repeated, deliberate provocations of Russia going back to the 1990s. Democratic and Republican administrations have pushed NATO to Russia's borders, violating our own solemn promise from the early 90s when we pledged that if Russia made this terrible concession of moving 400,000 troops out of East Germany and allowing the unification of Germany under a NATO army, a hostile army, that we would commit that after that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And James Baker gave that assurance, as did the British government officials and many, many others. And yet today we have surrounded Russia. We have moved it not 1 inch to the east, but 1,000 miles and 14 nations. We have surrounded Russia with missiles and military bases, something that we would never tolerate if the Russians did that to us. And statements from our government officials and think tanks lay out the goals for the Ukraine war: regime change in Russia, the overthrow of Vladimir Putin. This is what President Biden has said is our purpose in the Ukraine. The disabling and exhaustion of the Russian military and the dismembering of the Russian Federation. None of these objectives have anything to do with helping the Ukraine, which of course was the pretext for our involvement in the war. That's when our leaders told us that we were there for a humanitarian mission, but they've since acknowledged that there is a broader geopolitical agenda and that Ukraine is simply a pawn in a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Like teenagers playing World of Warcraft, these warmongers inside U.S. leadership draw up war games and scenarios and pretend that a nuclear war is winnable. That is a dangerous lie. It's an illusion that my uncle's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, called mass psychosis. These individuals do not appreciate what John F. Kennedy understood when he said of nuclear war, quote, "All that we have built, all that we have worked for would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. Even one nuclear explosion spreads radioactivity around the world. Can you imagine the consequence of a full nuclear exchange?" President Kennedy did. That's why he said, quote, "Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat of a nuclear war, To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence of the bankruptcy of our policy or a collective death wish for humanity. Let me say that again. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. The shameful fact is that for the last 20 years, the advocates of a militaristic foreign policy within the U.S. leadership have done exactly the opposite. Their belligerent strategy of maximum confrontation extends beyond Russia to China, where the same group within our government hopes to use Taiwan as a geopolitical pawn, the same way they used Iraq and Syria and now Ukraine, to further a vain fantasy of world domination through violent confrontation. A political leader voiced what would be considered today a spiritual maximum or a spiritual principle. Let's take up that call from 60 years ago and ask Americans, all of us, to re-examine our attitude. We have been immersed in a foreign policy discourse that is all about adversaries and threats and allies and enemies and domination. We've become addicted to comic book good versus evil narratives that erase complexity and blind us to the legitimate motives and the legitimate cultural and economic concerns and the legitimate security concerns of other peoples and other nations. We have internalized and institutionalized a reflex of violence as the response for any and all crises. Everything becomes a war. War on drugs, the war on terror, the war on cancer, war on climate change. This way of thinking predisposes us to wage endless wars abroad, wars and coups and bombs and drones and regime change operations and support for paramilitaries and juntas and dictators. None of this has made us safer, and none of it has burnished our leadership or our moral authority. But more importantly, we must ask ourselves, is this really who we are? Is this what we want to be? Is that what Americans' founders envisioned? Here's another spiritual principle, one that my uncles also referred to, when he said, quote, "We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. When we hold others in the belief that they are implacable enemies, they tend to mold themselves accordingly to our view of them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy or prediction that launches all players into a cycle of suspicion that my uncle warned against. They believe that we could not have warfare abroad without bringing that violence home to our streets, to our attitudes, to our communities. Foreign violence is inseparable from domestic violence. Both are aspects of a basic orientation and a basic set of priorities. We have toxins in our air and our soil and our water. We have deteriorating mental and physical health. These are the wages of war. But what will be the wages of peace? They will be healing of all the symptoms of America's decline. None of these are beyond our capacity to heal. We can restore America to the awesome vitality of the original Kennedy era. I'll end with one more piece of wisdom from my uncle. Quote, "What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not a peace of the grave or the security of a slave. I'm talking about a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables people and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely a peace for all men and women, but not merely a peace for our time, but a peace for all time." Thank you all very much.